and thank you for coming straight after lunch snoozy time to listen to In Audio, which I have been desperately trying not to mispronounce as inaudible all weekend. I'm Charlotte Bond. I am 1/3 of Breaking the Glass of the podcast. We do a twice a month podcast about women in speculative fiction, both fantastic female characters and also amazing authors. I also write horror, but I don't really think that's probably why I'm here. So I will let each of my panellists introduce themselves, and then we will dive straight in.
Hi, I hate introducing myself. I forget everything about me. But I am Beth Boltz. I write as E.M. Faulds, but I run the Speculative Spaces podcast, which talks to people in the speculative fiction industry, including writers and publishers and so forth.
Is it a sort of non-fiction podcast where you discuss things, or does it include stories, or a bit of both?
We include story recordings where it is a longer interview with one or two authors, but I also go around to lots of conventions and buttonhole people for reasons of getting them to promote their work, which is helpful because it gives me free content.
I'm Pippa Bailey, but you may know me on Facebook as Pippa Pilgrim. I am a horror writer. I do short story horror. I've generally worked with the Wicked Library for their podcast and help produce the Deadflix podcast as well, which is more towards reviewing watch-alongs with horror movies and that side of the spectrum, and less to do with horror fiction story. So I kind of hit both, and then I've also produced audiobooks for publishing companies and done audio works for other projects as well.
Hello, I'm Pauline Kirk. I also write as PJ Quinn. I'm here because I made an audiobook of one of my novels, Border 7, and I'm here to talk really about experience of making an audiobook and all the things I learned. It was a very steep learning curve. So I will take questions if anybody wants to make an audiobook later. I know there's one or two.
Sounds like you should sort of set up in the bar and have an appointment system. Okay, so my first question is about audiobooks and something that really bugs me. Do you think listening to an audiobook counts as reading the book or the story? I think back to the times when we used to all live in caves and the oral tradition was the only way of passing stories, and then people go, oh, it doesn't count if you listen to it. But I mean, that's just my personal opinion. What do you guys think? Do you think it is the same as reading? Do you think it's sort of a bit like reading but maybe a different experience? What do you think?
I definitely think it's reading. It's a similar, if not the same, experience to reading words on a page. You're still hallucinating vividly. You're still imagining yourself surrounded by these characters. You still go on the same journey with them like you would if you were reading a physical book. I definitely think that audiobooks are, it's a huge step in the right direction for the modern world we live in, where everyone wants to multitask, and you sometimes don't have time to sit down and read a novel, but you could go to work on the bus and listen to this audiobook and not miss your stop, or so any other range of things that you can get with an audiobook that you couldn't do with reading a physical book, but it is all definitely reading.
I would think that it is partly a different form, absolutely as valid, but listening, there's probably been quite a bit of editing of the book gone on so that it became adaptable for audio. So it is different, perhaps, to the original novel, but in no way inferior, and you're using your imagination in just the same way when you listen to something as when you read it on the page. So I don't understand this sort of snobbery towards audiobooks.
Oh yeah, it's just as valid as we're saying, but like I have ADHD possibly, or maybe something like that, and I read in a very different fashion to the one I listen. I read kind of sentences back and forth, and then I'll linger on a word that I particularly want to think about, and I'll come back and then I'll reread a passage and like this. Whereas if someone's reading it to you, you can't stop them and go, wait, go back. you know, so it is different, but I mean, it's words. You know, you're expanding your mind. The only thing that might be difficult is the reading comprehension skills that you learn, but presumably people already have that.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to make an assumption here, and I perhaps should have checked beforehand, that I'm assuming you're all doing it like me in your spare time, not being paid, not sponsored by anyone, not employed. Yeah, okay. So obviously, for our podcast, I record mine on the kitchen table, and every now and again I have to pause as the cat scratches in the litter tray, and every now and again, you know, Lucy has to kick her cat out. We're big cat people. But obviously, you know, you're creating something that's good quality and high quality. So as well as kind of doing it on your own, are there any roles for professionals within what you do? I mean, would you think about hiring professionals? Have you consulted with any in, you know, creating your podcasts and your stories and things?
I did use a studio because it was already booked. Why I ended up running my own audiobook was that it was originally going to be a podcast drama, and the project fell through. And I had already done quite a bit of work on recording the narration. And so rather than let the thing drop, I'm rather bloody-minded, and I decided to carry on with it. So I carried on with a studio that had already been booked. I wouldn't have chosen to do so on my own because it was expensive and they were professionals. But it was a tremendous experience from my point of view. I learnt an enormous amount about audio, about equipment, about how to stand, how to turn the page. Every little rustle is picked up. So yes, I'm glad I did it, but it wasn't the cheapest way.
I think there's definitely a place for professionals or people who have taken the time to learn how to do it, like you're saying, with learning the little things like how to turn a page or how to do things in the best way to get the correct sound. But it's things like nowadays with, for example, like Dirt Mag's Sandman Part 2 dropped a couple of days ago, and the audio production on that is just absolutely amazing, and the draw for it is, if you know the person that's doing the voices, you know the voice actor, that is a draw alone to the book, to listen to this book. Even if you may have never seen it in print, you've never experienced it before, sometimes knowing who is reading that book is a huge draw.
I'm notoriously cheap about these things. I set up a podcast on my own using the sort of skills I learned along the way as a web designer, and my other half also has a hobby of music production, so between the two of us we kind of had a lot of things covered already. I think one of the draws about podcasting is it is a thing that you can start yourself from the kitchen table. It's a subversive art form right now. It's like ham radio used to be in the 70s, I guess. But it's like anybody can do it. Anybody can get your podcast onto Spotify or Apple, you know, iTunes. And that's ridiculous to me. You know, it's like, it's very strange that you can do that, but it's also amazing, and it can be done from a kitchen table. It can be done all the way up into beautiful studio productions and everything in between, so it's a beautiful thing for me that there is room for it, but there also you don't need it.
I would think there is a difference between recording a whole novel and the shorter podcast, and maybe technical skills need to be higher for the novel than the podcast, which is to some extent a chat and a relationship with the listener. Recording something that is 13 hours of listening, that is very demanding, and maybe the technical quality needs to be a bit higher. The trouble with the kitchen table in my case would be that there's a lot of surround noise in my area, and a good mic will pick up really distant sounds. So if you're going to do it on your own, from your own table, then you've got to find a way of somehow really soundproofing the whole of your kitchen table area, and making sure nobody comes to the door and rings the bell and that kind of thing, because it will pick everything up and you have to re-record if it does. We had trouble in the studio that there were planes going overhead, and the mics picked the planes up. Even though it was a soundproof studio, I was surprised you could hear the plane in the distance. So you've got to consider, what am I trying to do? Okay, what facilities do I need for it?
So you can compensate to some extent if you're not going for that incredibly high quality that you would get for an audio drama or an audiobook. For the podcast, things like you can get some directional mics that only will just pick up stuff that's really right in front of them, which is important. But the surrounding noise thing you do have to compensate for so badly when you do it in your home. Like some guy will just start up his motor mower halfway through an interview that you're doing, or start revving their engines outside. And I have actually moved house from a really quiet area to a busy main street, which is actually not in the best mood to be for the podcast purposes. But you can use, if you get into the sound production side of things, you can compensate to an extent, but you always will have to cut and retake things when there's planes and all these kind of stuff. Yeah.
We kind of moved away from the question about professionals, so I just wanted to briefly, before we go on to this new and interesting one, I want to say that our professional that we employ is Megan. So although Lucy and I contribute a lot to the podcast, it's always been Megan's baby. She thought it up, and her technical skills are just amazing. And I don't know half of what she does, and she does a lot of marketing as well. But that is what she does as her job. She kind of wanted to branch out and do something for herself. So I think we're kind of fortunate that we kind of have the professional who started it out, and that's worked really well for us. But I was thinking about what you're saying about planes going overhead. I mean, how many takes does it have to do? Do you just sit down and do your podcast? Because obviously that's what we do. We, especially if we have a guest on, we sit down and we talk to them and we have a chat a bit like this. And then we record it all, and at the end, someone goes back and edits it all around. And I had to do readings for my book, I think when Fantasycon was online and things like that. And oh my God, I was like, take 17, for God's sake, because it was just such a different experience for me. So I mean, how many takes does it take you? Are you getting better at it as well? You know, each time do you avoid first time all my pages rustled, second time the pages didn't rustle but there were planes. I mean, are you refining it each time? Have you now got to a point where you can just do it smoothly, or are you still learning?
With podcasts, unfortunately, sometimes it's been you'll record an entire thing and a piece of equipment fails and you have to scrap it. Or you've recorded something and there's this constant echo, you don't know where it's come from, and you have to scrap it. And like I said, with a guest, you don't want to have to do that. You want to be able to just go back through and do an edit, and you do refine your skills over time. You do get more clear. You're able to look at, right, I know that I will be able to, I know this particular word that's bothered me. I've worked on this word, I know that I can phrase it right, I know that I've got the timing right on the stanza or whatever it is, and you're able to just sort of bring it to life. When I was recording, so I recorded the audio adaptation of Forest Underground for Sinister Horror Company, and that was a lot of takes. That was a lot of takes, and that was unfortunately living with a very noisy housemate and having to move into the basement with a tent and a duvet over the tent because I didn't have a studio at the time, and this was a basement in a very old Victorian house. So it had an open stream that ran through the end of it that supplied water that went through the different houses in this row. So it was there with like the little children's garden padding to try and block out the sound to reduce the number of takes. It was propped up on my knees with my special microphone that I'll show at some point, which makes it much easier because you record to itself and you can stop and start it as much as you want. But yeah, it really it's a lot of practice to reduce the number of takes, and you do get better over time. You can become much more professional in what you do.
With recording a novel, I found that I needed to practice, but then I practice whenever I do a reading. If I'm reading my own poetry or I'm reading a short story, I always practice at home. So I was practicing at home first of all, before I went to the studio, because you pay for studio time. So you really don't want to be messing about doing something in the studio that time and time again, it's costing. So rehearsing at home first of all, and then we learned together that it was better to do it straight through and then edit little bits rather than keep stopping and starting again. to keep the momentum up of the story and the narration, to keep the mood up. Otherwise, I would lose the mood as the narrator. And we just recorded a whole chapter at a time, about 20 minutes, 30 minutes. One of the issues I found was standing all that time with the mic and the baffles either side of me and not moving, because it would pick up, it was so sensitive, it would pick up my shuffles. So I had to learn to be absolutely still and to slide the pages across. Now, these are things that you only do really with a professional studio. But if you're doing that, then you have got to learn technique, shall we say. Once I'd learned them, there were a lot fewer takes. I wasn't messing up in the way I was initially.
One of the things you have to do when you're doing a podcast, for example, is just get over yourself. Get over the fact that you go and not try and go back and edit every single little tick and error out, because it actually makes the podcast sound artificial. So you kind of have to try and not be a perfectionist, and then things come off more natural. When you've got guests, like we would record stories that they would read, and depending on the guest, they're not professional readers necessarily, and there's a different level of, yes, I've read it at conventions before, or I've read it for book events, or not at all. And you just say, just go ahead, and if you mess up, just go back one sentence and start again. But if you go through, there was one guest I had, who shall not be named, who had a little bit of cheese before he came on the podcast. And was slightly trying to silently burp during his reading. Now that I did edit out, because you could really hear it. But
Mouth noise.
mouth noise, clicky mouth. Yeah. People who tap the table for emphasis. And it's like right near your recorder, and it's like, please stop doing that, please stop doing that, please stop doing that. But no, most of the time, don't be a perfectionist, just, as you said, go back and edit it out, rather, because you kill the flow if you try and get things perfect, especially during a conversation.
Well, I sent my questions out in advance, and as we were sitting here, Beth opened her bag and went, oh, look what I've got. And I was so excited because I thought she brought me a puppy. But she hasn't. She has brought some props for our next question, which is, what is the most essential piece of audio equipment you own? And mine is a microphone, and it's just plain and black, and it's very impressive. This is what Beth brought. So, but you brought something as well, you said. So, would you care to show us, if you have brought props, your favourite piece of audio equipment?
This looks like a taser. I actually got stopped in Dublin, on the way to Dublin Worldcon, by the security who had to swipe my bag down for explosives because this looks like a stun gun to them on the X-ray. And it's a Tascam recorder, so it's called the DR40X linear PCM recorder, and it's just something that you can take around with you and you record onto the thing, as opposed to needing a laptop, as opposed to it running out of space on things. It's got a huge memory, and it just goes straight into there, and it does very little else, which is useful. But you can then take the recordings, and if you go outside, you need one of these, which is a dead cat. And that is a fluffy thing which stops wind noise. And if you're recording outside, even the slightest zephyr breeze will go on your recorder if you don't have one of them. And I found that out in EasterCon when we were recording, also near Heathrow. Yeah. Oh gosh. It was a challenge. And that was one of my first con recording sessions that I did.
For those who are taking notes, is it really called a dead cat? Or
it really is.
So you search for it, there you go.
But you could also call it a baffle, things like that.
I've always gone with dead cat.
Dead cat.
Well, I'm just thinking if you search Amazon for dead cat, it might come back with an interesting array of...
Maybe fluffy microphone cover?
Yeah, I'd say baffle, wind baffle, dead cat.
One of the things now that makes audios a lot easier, I think, is that so much more software has come on the market that can be used at home. even 5-10 years ago, I think we would more have had to hire a studio than now. It is possible to buy things, like you're having demonstrated, and to download things even, that make it much more possible to do things yourself at home.
This is called a Mic Me. It's an unusual little microphone. It's a German one, and I got it through a Kickstarter. I think, no, an Indiegogo, back maybe 5 years ago now. And it's a really weird bit of kit. It's a studio mic. It records to itself. You can also plug it into a PC and use it as a standing mic. You can Bluetooth, and it will Bluetooth record to your tablet. You can edit within it. It also has updatable technology, so it gets better. I think it cost me 300 quid, maybe 400 quid when I backed it, because I'd never seen them before. This is the original prototype version, so there's much better versions now. You can find their website. You have to get the English version of it, but it's recording it now. It's good. It doesn't need a dead cat or anything. It does it itself. I highly recommend them if you're looking for something that you can just take anywhere, not slip it in your pocket because that's illegal. But you know, you want to do something on the go and you don't have to hold it. It's also, you can just screw it on top of a stand as well. Yeah. So it's certainly made a difference to my ability to do things, and that I actually record the audiobook on that. So it was good enough to do that.
Could you repeat the name of that?
It's called a Mic Me, so M-I-K-M-E. Or it might be Mic Me, I'm not sure, but I always call it a Mic Me.
Things have moved on a lot since the days when I used to record people with a handheld tape recorder, and then you have to transcribe it afterwards. And that's not so very long ago. I think we all take things for granted now, don't realise how much things have moved on.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been sharing all bits of tech, and one of the questions I put forward to you guys was, if someone gave you a large lump sum of money, what is the one thing you would buy to improve your audiobook? And I mean, like, big. I mean, if you really want your own studio, but also something... I see Pauline nodding her head there.
A garden studio. I priced them. I got as far as doing that. They are horrendously dear. But, yeah, give me the money, I'll do it.
Same, I'm saying.
Oh, see, I was thinking more like, you know, $5,000 as a lump sum. That's a lot of money for me. But I don't know if anyone else has seen this advertised. If you're looking at audio stuff, you've probably seen it pop up. It's like a standalone booth. You might have seen, there's a guy singing into it. It's like a head height booth, and you step into this thing, and it just covers the top part of your body. I know I keep putting my arm in front of the microphone, which isn't helping. It just covers the top half of your body, and it works like having a full studio, the space to set up a microphone inside, the space to set up stuff to read from, and it looks absolutely amazing. And I think it's probably about £5,000, and I was like, that is something that I'm planning on investing in the near future, because if you live in a small space and you want to do something studio quality, you can't have access to a studio because it's super expensive, you don't have your own studio because you're not a millionaire, then it looks like an amazing investment. I have no idea what it's called, sorry.
So, we've talked about, obviously, tech and all this kind of stuff and how we do it, but let's cast our minds back to the very beginning. When you were starting out, what is the one piece of advice that you would give to someone who's either thinking of doing audiobooks or starting a podcast? If you could go back and talk to yourself at the bar, what would you say?
I would say look out for phantom power.
Phantom power?
Yeah. See, some guys know what that means. Now, when you have certain microphones, they don't run passively like you would expect. You can't just plug and play. You need a separate thing that adds the power to the microphone. So always check before you buy any microphone whether it requires extra equipment just to make it work. Also, it depends on the laptop plug ports you've got. Some of them you can plug your microphone into the headphone socket and it works, and some you can't. So always check that kind of thing when you're looking to buy new equipment. And of course, as I said, try not to be too perfectionist when you're doing a podcast. Audiobooks, maybe you need to be a little bit perfectionist, but...
I would say if you are thinking of venturing into an audiobook, consider you are an independent, how are you going to market it? Because the big publishers are bringing them out virtually the same time as the printed version of their books. It's become a package, so that quite often a publisher will produce printed version, audiobook and ebook virtually simultaneously, and you are competing with them. So look to how you're going to market it. Are you going to use Amazon Audible? In which case you've got to meet their requirements and you need to know what they are. And their standards actually are pretty high technically, particularly on quality of sound and variation in pitch. And they will knock you back. They listen to it all, their technical equipment listens, and they will knock you back if there's too much variation in pitch or volume, and you've got to re-record that bit or at least tweak it. So you need to know what you're doing. Now, I didn't. I'll frankly admit I didn't. I was thrown in the deep end. Somebody else was managing it all. I was just turning up to read it, an edited script. I ended up, because I took it over, doing my own editing for reading and dealing with promotion, publicity and all the rest of it. I could have done a much better job on promotion if I'd had time. But of course, I was trying to keep the thing going. So my advice would be, if you're considering it, do your homework, find out about marketing, where you're going to market it, if you're going with Audible, what they want, etc. Then do the job, not afterwards.
I definitely go down the route of preparation, because if you've not got the perfect equipment and you've not got the most brilliant laptop, it's like a lot of things. It's even like with a B movie. If you can look at the things you don't have the money, you don't have everything else, you can negate that by preparing. So it's if you're doing an audiobook, know the book, read the book, know the characters, know the feel for what it is that you want to put out into the world. If it's a podcast, know your subject. It's like today, we all know a bit about audio, so we've come here and we're able to talk about it. You don't want to be, ruffling papers to find notes. You don't want to be worrying about, I already said it, no. It's like having a tick sheet, knowing exactly what you're talking about, but preparation can negate so much of the funding, the equipment and everything else if you just know what you're doing.
See, the problem with being the moderator and let everyone go first is they've stolen all my answers. So what they said was pretty much what I was going to say about preparation. I guess if you're looking to set up a podcast, have a look at what's already out there and make sure you're not going to clash with someone else. Or if you are going to clash with what you want to do, try and find a unique spin to go on it.
Or just do it better.
It's all like, individual opinion, isn't it, on that as to what's better. But I mean, yeah, so I'm also conscious now that we're about halfway through and we spent a lot of time talking about tech, which is fascinating. But I also wanted to talk about selecting pieces, particularly audiobooks and stories. So is there really a particular type of story that works really well with an audiobook format, and do you have to amend the stories sometimes to make them more engaging? So what kind of amendments do you make? I know that I'm doing a reading this afternoon, and I wrote my story as I wanted it to appear in publication, and then I went through and I cut out a load of bits because I went, you know what, you don't need that extra description there. And it was like, I had things like, he said morosely, and then I was like, well, I'm going to say it morosely, so I don't need to put it in and I'll sound like an idiot. Although now I think about it, I don't think I cut that bit. So if you're at my reading, don't laugh when I get to that bit. But, so even for me, editing like a 10-minute story that I had to read, I found it a very different experience. So what about you guys? What kind of stories do you look for? Do you deliberately go, that story doesn't work, I'm not going to take it? Or do you look at it and go, I think it will work and I'll amend it? And what sort of amendments do you make?
I was recording a book that had been chosen by other people. Therefore they thought it would work. I did, as I edited, discover exactly what you're saying. Well, I'm going to put that tone into my voice. I don't need to have he said, she said. In fact, I was acting it out, I think, becoming different people. Not trying to alter my voice too much, not becoming a male voice, but at least trying to give a distinction between the different voices in a conversation. But Certainly some books will, I think, adapt better than others. A book that's got lots of action in, lots of narration, that is through character rather than description. So big chunks of description aren't going to work. Let people imagine it for themselves. Just drop enough in for them to imagine the scene. Cut perhaps a whole paragraph that describes the scene. If you can get it over so people are imagining it, then that's quicker and more effective than lots and lots of words.
I found when writing things specifically for audio production, not adapting things that I've already written, but writing things specifically, I would tend to write in first person because it's easier for the audience to get into the feel of the character if it's in first person. Or things like if you're recording it yourself or you're sending it off to a production company, it's how many characters are you going to have in this story? Are you going to need a range of voices? Are you competent to do multiple voices yourself? Do you want to have conversation in there? Because that again changes the landscape of what the story is, because you've got to have this bounce back. You can get wonderful stories with just first person and one person dealing with things and never having a conversation at all. I know because I've written that, and then it's the same with I've adapted stories that are in third person to first person because that form was far more engaging with an audience, was far more, I suppose, captivating than it was in third person because, again, with all the he said, she said, the description of everything. I mean, nobody walks up to a mirror and describes himself in the mirror in first person. Or you really hope they don't. And you don't need to hear that in an audiobook. You just want to know what they're doing. So that's
yeah. Well, I don't actually read any of my own stories, so I'm not really responsible for the selection, but it's very important that if you read your story into a podcast, that counts as publication. If you release it to the public, it's published. So if you have a story that you're hoping to submit to a magazine, and you read it on a podcast just for fun, to sort of get it out there, you've burned that story. So don't do that. If you want, you can read a reprint. That's fine. If you want, you can read an excerpt of a longer story it should be okay, I think. As long as it's not, you've read the whole story, now no one will want it. So, but the authors read their stories well because they know them well, because they've written them. So it's always the ones who have read aloud at conventions. I would recommend going to the open mic if you haven't before, if you want to read it. Get some practice in. It's all good.
When you were talking about, obviously, first person is quite a good way to narrate a story. When I did reading back in Glasgow, I chose to write a piece that was first person from a girl's point of view. And it worked quite well because I got all the intonation and it was fine. But what if it's a boy and you want to write a story about a boy and it's first person, but you're a girl narrating it, or vice versa? Do you get someone else in to do that? Do you go ahead and do it anyway? Do you think it affects the reader? I don't know if this is something you've ever come across, but when we were talking about it, it occurred to me.
definitely when I've written things for the Wicked Library podcast to be released, they will approach normally afterwards and ask, what kind of voice do you want for this? Where would you prefer somebody with an accent from this area? This is a male voice. Do you specifically want a man to do it? When I've done them myself, I'll do all the voices and I will just change the intonations depending on whether it's a more masculine voice or a more feminine voice. I'm quite happy to do that. But I think it is quite nice when you have the choice. If you can choose a very specific male voice for a male voice, a female voice for a female voice, or in the case of a story I released back in February, it was a non-binary story. And I specifically asked for somebody to read it that either was non-binary or was non-specific gender, and they made an effort to try and do that for me because that's what I wanted this story to have. Yeah.
I have just seen the time, so I will quickly round off with a very silly question, and then I will throw it open to everybody else. So diving straight to the very last question, if you wrote a book, who is the celebrity you'd most want to read it? Or if you run a podcast, which celebrity guest would you most like to have on? And I would have to vote for Jodie Whittaker, because the girls do not like Doctor Who, and I'd love to have Jodie on and go and just chat with her about stuff. So that would be my idea. What about anyone else?
I think I would go for Emma Thompson because of her appeal to younger listeners. Audiobooks, podcasts, etc. are appealing to younger listeners because they've grown up with them. And you've got to, marketing I talked about, you've got to consider what is going to be your market. And if I could have someone like her, or even somebody even younger, it would be much better than Judi Dench, much as I love Judi Dench. You've got to go for your market with your choice of person.
Just for the joy of it, although it won't be practical now, David Bowie. I think he would be wonderful reading an audiobook. I would totally go for that. I'd love to have him on a podcast. I mean, obviously it's not practical now, but yeah, David Bowie would be absolutely fabulous.
So Terry Pratchett.
Oh, good choice.
Bit kind of late now.
I'm noticing a theme of people who've passed on. In
If it was a living person, I guess you'd have to say someone like Neil Gaiman, who could bring the acclaim to your podcast by just being there.
Yeah, and I mean, I've heard him in conversation, and he's just fascinating. So. Yeah. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, so I'll open it up. Do we have any questions that anybody would like to put forward? Yeah.
So how long was the learning curve from when you said, right, I'm going to start a podcast, to actually starting it?
So just to repeat it, how long was the learning curve before you said, I'm going to do this, to actually going for it?
It was quite a few months. I started with a seed of an idea. The main thing being that I have a circle of writer friends, and I was always asking them questions, and I thought, well, why not use this power for good? And I thought, well, they've got such a lot of information. But I mean, going from that seed of an idea to going, well, now I need to know everything. So several months, I would say, if you are going from zero. And then obviously there's still some learning curve after you start. So would I say I've reached the pinnacle? No, I still got a lot to learn. Like things like normalization. Stuff like that, where you get sound levels of your podcast should remain similar from episode to episode. Because if it doesn't, when someone's binge listening, they go, whoa, like that, because you've suddenly gone really loud in their ear. So, yeah, still learning.
With podcast-wise, I'd started doing a reviewing podcast called Google Guides, probably like 6 or 7 years ago now, and I was writing, reviewing, and I just went, it'd be much easier if I just did this in audio. And so I did. And that just led to me doing other audio stuff after that, and writing horror came from that. With audiobooks, I did a lot of public speaking previously. In my day job, I have to do a lot of public speaking. And so I was already quite confident, competent, and I just I had a friend that was looking for a British female voice, and I said, well, my voice it's a little bit unusual, it's a little bit received pronunciation. I'm a RAF brat, so I'm from all over the place, so I don't really sound like I'm from anywhere. And my husband's South African, so I get a bit of everything in there as well. And I just said, yeah, I can do it. Here's an example. So I learned how to do the audio production, I learned how to do it all, I studied it, and then I produced the book.
I mean, just before Pauline goes in, I'm intrigued that you said I was doing reviews and I figured audio would be easier. Yeah. Did it turn out that way?
Yeah, it was great. It was great. I stopped because I just ran out of things to review at the time, and I ran out of money to buy any more stuff.
I suppose I learned over years in recording poems, particularly for other people's CDs. I did that a lot, mainly for friends, but also occasionally for payment. And that sort of experience of knowing your own voice and knowing how to project things is invaluable. I think you do need that to start with. But most of us got it, let's face it, if we're writers. We all perform. The tech side, well, a very steamy year, I think. And if I did it again, I would know an awful lot more.
I think, for as I said, Megan was the brainchild behind all this, so I can't say how long she pondered it before she came and approached Lucy and I, but I must admit that trying to wrangle the three of us probably took more time than just setting it up yourselves. If you look at our earlier episodes, you'll find that we tended to do one-to-one interviews, and then we decided actually it worked much better if there was quite a lot of us, and we get more of a sort of feel about it. And like I say, we're always learning, there's always tech issues, we do new ones. So we record ours with Zencaster at the moment, which has changed and got some new bugs and some new gremlins, but some new advantages and whatever. So there's always something new to learn, and I think the learning curve just keeps going. Does anybody else have any questions? Oh, yeah.
What kind of software would you recommend for people starting out at the kitchen table?
What kind of software if you're starting at the kitchen table? Well, like I say, we use Zencaster. I think, did we use Skype to begin with? I mean, ours, when we interview people, and of course the three of us are all other ends of the country, so we need a recording software that will work online and record all of us and download everything. So ours is a little bit different. What about you guys?
Was using Audible, but there's been some interesting developments with Audible in that they were bought by a software company that I think was Russian, and they had some interesting, oh, by the way, we can now do this, this, and this with your software, we can scan your laptop, etc. And then they had to back down quite severely because everyone was like, no, we're not doing that. But if you've got an older version of Audible, it's fine. It's if you update it to the latest version, there may be some things you need to just look into. But, I mean, it's free. You can't really go cheaper.
Audible for me too. That's what I always work with for the book production. Audacity, actually. There we go. That's better. Audacity is the program I use. That's free.
Audacity. That's what I meant.
Yeah, Audacity. That's what I thought you meant.
You did.
That's what I thought you meant. Audacity, and I thought, yeah, Audacity. It's great. It's free. It's very easy to use. You can edit very easily in it. And other than that, I mean, we use Zoom for interviewing people because people are all over the world, and it's just much easier to do that.
Obviously, we've all learned how to use Zoom, Teams, all the various different forms, Skype. One good thing that's come out of all these lockdowns is that it's shot us all forward in terms of technology. And I think nothing now of having a choir practice on Zoom, which is very strange, but we have learnt it, and I think there may be a great boom suddenly in this kind of work as a result of so many ordinary people learning how to do it.
I was going to say, do you have a question, or were you going to say we're running
No,
out
I
of
just
time?
wanted to chip in a little note about Audacity, just if anyone wants to try it and learn it. Do bear in mind that Audacity, when you make a change to your soundtrack, it actually changes your recorded file. So it's just something to watch out for when you're editing audio, that you have multiple copies of it so that you can go back if it's gone wrong. If you're using something like the Adobe one, either Audition or something like Reaper, this is more of a sound mixer that you actually then record an output at the end of it, so it never changes your original files. It's just a thing to note about Audacity, that it's not edits aren't safe. You have to work quite carefully with it.
I've not come across that problem.
You know, okay.
There's another question behind Bill.
Is there another question?
There was, but if we're finished, we're finished.
If you're super quick, I think we might be okay.
I just wondered if anybody's got any tips with regards to maintaining character. When you're recording multiple characters, often with different voices, it can be hard to make sure that that's consistent across, particularly a longer thing. So any particular tips and tricks as to how to maintain that?
I would say act it out at home until those people become characters you know personally, and you carry them with you, and you stay in character with that person as you record, just the same as if you were playing on a stage. That was what I found.
No, I totally agree, and I also find if it's something that you're going to be away for a little while and come back to, taking notes about the specific characteristics you chose, listening back to what you previously recorded to make sure that you get the same intonations, the same pronunciations of words, because sometimes I'll drop into bath, and then it depends on the character and who I'm talking to as to how I talk, and that's something to keep notes of and to come back to, and that makes it a lot easier if you're going to have a little space between times.
That'd be the thing
No, it's not applicable, I'm afraid, to me either. But it is a fantastic question, and it's a really good one to wrap up on. I feel we could talk for several hours on audio tips, but I'm also conscious that we've come to the end of our time. So I'd like to say thank you to our wonderful panellists for coming along and talking to us and sharing their wisdom.
Thank you. And if any of you would like to be on the podcast, come and find me in the bar.